Oh, we're good to go. Good afternoon, folks. Thank you for joining us. My name is Przemek Klosak. I work for the CATL in the role of Assistant Director for Instruction and Innovation, and I also co-curate this speaker series, the AI Horizons Summer Speaker Series, and I'm very pleased to welcome Antonio Hamilton, a scholar, a writer, a PhD candidate in English writing studies, more specifically. He's also a consultant for the Writers Workshop and an assistant director for the Center for Writing Studies. His research is centered around understanding student perception and organic usage of AI, as well as impact of AI on writing identities. He's going to speak with us about his research today. The title of his talk is, and you can see it on your screens, the new college student AI-dentity, GenAI's impact on students' writing processes and writing identities. I'll be monitoring the chat. Please, if any of you online audience, if you have any questions at any point, please post them in the chat. Once I see your question, I will place a thumbs up icon under your question, and I will relay it to our speaker. Additionally, please be aware that we have another talk coming up this Friday also at 2 p.m. That one is fully remote since our speaker resides in Grand Rapids, Michigan. We will be talking about learning with AI, but not learning with AI, but without over-relying on AI. But I digress. At this moment, I would like to turn it over to Antonio Hamilton.
Awesome. Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending today. Those who are online, those who are in person. I'm happy to talk a little bit about my dissertation project today. So what I'm going to be talking about today is going to be rooted in the discussion of what I've done in my dissertation. So still very, I guess in my early stages. I'm still writing it, still analyzing data, but I want to give some samples of what I'm finding thus far in my research. So with that being said, I'll go ahead and move on to what we'll be discussing today. So I'll start off kind of beginning about what kind of prompted my, venture into like AI, what were like some of like the foundational things and ideas that kind of have prompted my perceptions of GenAI in this current moment. So I'll talk about like automated writing technologies, like more broadly, to kind of ground the conversation initially. And then I'll talk about my dissertation project, kind of what motivations led to what I have ended up doing. And then I'll go through some sample highlights and findings from each of my studies thus far. So my survey that I've conducted, interviews, and observation interviews for my last study that I'm doing, and then kind of wrap up today with what is like the future of Gen AI in regards to what I'm like seeing in my studies and how we can take some common themes I'm finding and what recommendations I have at this present moment. And then, of course, obviously, there will be some time for Q&A to respond to any questions you have or inputs and whatnot. So automated writing technology. So I began like understanding this when I took a class that was focusing on like algorithms and kind of discussing like the impact this has on certain different types of software and technology. And specifically, this was looking at automated writing evaluation software. So like your Grammarly, your Right to Learn, your pro writing aids, technologies that give feedback on writing more like the syntax and grammatical level. And so that was kind of like my first like kind of venture into like the space of like automated technologies. But then some of the conversations that kind of helped kind of guide how I like understood these technologies was kind of looking at like the drudgery of grading. So these technologies came out of a need to help instructors and teachers handle the copious amounts of like essays they have to grade because no one wants to grade 50 or 100 essays. So they're like, oh, here's this technology that can help do that now. But with that, obviously new conversations arose, like what does it mean when students are writing for robots? What happens when the robot or the technology is grading their writing? And they're going for like that feedback loop of just the technology doing the feedback. And then looking at like how does this conceptualize what writing looks like in Western academic settings. So it tends to like prioritize standardized traditional rhetoric, so very Western styles of writing that these softwares tended to give feedback in relation to that. And then writing process. So how is this impacting the writing process when students are, constantly going back to like, Grammarly or whatever AWE that they're using, how is this impacting their process as they're, writing the piece of text that they're doing. So those kind of are like the kind of grounding ideas that help me think about like about AI. So because I see a lot of the similar conversations, this in some ways reversed when we think of AI. So instead of the drudgery of grading, we have the drudgery of writing. So students, don't want to write. At least that's our perception, and it may be true to some degree. But like here's this technology now that can write for you. So if you don't like writing, AI can do it for you. And so how do we handle that? And I think that's been the fun of the last several years since the launch of ChatGPT and other AI softwares. And then evaluating robotic writing. So instead of, the student writing for the robot, now it's the teachers responding to the robot. So now what does that mean for evaluation and understanding how students are engaging in critical thinking and writing? And then once again, standardized traditional rhetoric arises again in this. These softwares tend to write in a certain way unless you prompt it otherwise. But even if you prompt it otherwise, it's not always the most proficient in those other stylized ways of writing. So it tends to still promote standard traditional rhetoric. And then writing process comes into play again. So what stages are they using AI to help them conduct writing? And then even more so, how does this impact their writing identities? Like how do they perceive themselves as writers when they're using AI at different moments? And how does this shift their confidence in their writing abilities when they're using AI? And so those are kind of how kind of the foundational like ideas and concepts that kind of help ground like my venture into GenAI and what has led to my dissertation project. And then I'll really obviously think about the benefits and concerns. Obviously, there's more than just what's listed here, but these are some of the ones that I think kind of important that I've been like navigating through over the last couple of years. So the motivations for our dissertation project. So firstly, there's a vast landscape of GenAI policies from, policies from different departments, different instructors changing their policies throughout the semester. So how are students existing in that landscape? How are they navigating going from one class to the next and where you can't use it or you can use it here or you can use it for these purposes? Like, so how are students responding to that? How are students responding to the rapidly evolving technology of AI? It's changing every day. It's getting better. There's more options to choose from. How does that influence students' like choices of which platform they use? And then thinking about how these technologies market themselves. Fortunately or unfortunately, because I study this, every ad that pops up on social media or YouTube is now some AI software. It's annoying, but it's also fascinating to see how they market themselves as like helping you write more human-like. And so that's clearly a response to academia saying that AI does not sound human. And what our AI software is now saying, we can help you write like a human, but you are human. So what do you mean? But like, how are students like uptaking that and using that to motivate their choices and their uses of it and how they and when they use it? And then most importantly, the lack of student voices, I think has been the biggest motivation for this project is to understand like what do students think about this technology, because I feel like a lot of like the last few years a lot of the conversation has been very much at the administration level of like the top down, like the teachers are freaking out, administration's freaking out, or here's how we can address this with policies here, and then you have style guys telling you how to cite AI. It's been very reactive, and I think taking a step back and looking at how like students generally think about this is like a good point of access to understand how we actually may approach this. Because I think what has been clearly demonstrated over the last few years is that regardless of these policies, students are still using this. So let's like shift our perspective of looking at how students are using this. So understanding their organic usage, like so how are they actually using it, not our assumptions of how we may be thinking they're using it. And then also understanding like what their opinions, perceptions of this technology, because I think is a lot more nuanced than we may think at times. And I think what I'll talk through today is my research has shown me thus far. And so the guiding questions that kind of have shaped my dissertation project are, What are student writers' perceptions of GenAI's ability to help them write, help them with their writing, and how are writers using GenAI in their writing process? So understanding what this looks like when this is part of the process, and then understanding their perceptions. And there's a lot of things that go into that, but those are the kind of the basic overarching questions that I want to get a better understanding of what students are doing when it comes to AI. So for my first study, I did a survey that was distributed to undergraduate students and composition classes. So it was a survey, had a bunch of questions. The questions were typically looking to get insights into like when they were using it, how frequently they were using it, what parts of the process they were using it, to just get a basic understanding of what does their writing world looks like when they use AI. And then what are their perceptions of some kind of ethical questions about usage? So like, if you use it this many times, do you consider that academic dishonesty? So seeing if that aligns with how we're perceiving what academic dishonesty looks like when using AI. So there's a lot of questions, but it gave me a good like basis of like maybe what directions to go with, because this was the first study I did. So it kind of gave a lot of things to latch on to initially. So I don't have all of my every single sample of all the questions because that would be a lot to go through, but I took out some things I want to highlight. So what do you wish instructors knew about student use? So these are some quotes I want to highlight. You can see the first one. There's this perception that it's not malicious. I feel classes don't give an outline for how to write essays anymore. AI teaches you how to write essays and can be a valuable learning asset. So this was reflective of other optional questions students could respond to, where they could basically fill in the blank and give extra opinions. And so this is one. So this was representative of other answers people gave to this question, of feeling like they didn't think the classroom or the teacher was giving them what they needed, and here's AI helping them navigate that. And so in their mind, it isn't something that's hurting them, it's helping them. And then I wish writing instructors accepted the fact that it's okay to use AI. So there's very much the sentiment that, yes, it can be bad, but I feel like I'm using it in a way that's helping me succeed in this space. And then that the people use it more than we think. So I think that's important, because I think that reflects back to, in spite of like, genetic policy that says you can't use it, students are still going to use it and are still using it. So I think this kind of highlights that there is a use of it and there's a use that is aiding them. The next question, one of the questions I want to highlight is what steps you take after receiving suggestions from these technologies. So the results to this showed that there is some level of engagement with the output. And I think what to me this highlighted is that maybe the concern or the question is the quality of interaction with AI, not necessarily that they don't interact with the output, but maybe like they don't know how to do it or they're not doing the best job of it. So maybe that's the question, not like, they're just being careless. They just maybe not know how. And then why have you used these technologies for your academic writing? So most of the reasons tend to reflect like they use it at the beginning stages and the ending stages of the writing process. So they're using it to help them get started, to get that initial, ideas, and then they use it at the very end to help them polish the writing before they want to, submit it. So it's very much those bookends. And then during what parts of the academic writing process do you use those technologies? So once again, it's showing that it's usually the bookend. So like the polishing, correcting grammar, or helping them understand how to do the assignment or understand the reading or whatnot. So this question was asked in two different ways, because I think it kind of is telling that like those are the stages that people tend to be most concerned about, like before you submit it, and then getting started to do the thing and not wanting to, and maybe sit in those moments of writer's block. So these results show that students use AI to help them polish writing. So this, I think, is really reflective that editing is still a very big concern for a lot of people, that they think that is a huge part of assessment. That is, if my grammar is incorrect, I'm going to fail the paper. And so they're using AI as a way to help them navigate that. They use AI to better understand how to begin the writing. So I think there's a lot of anxiety that comes to like not doing something correctly. And here's AI offering a way to maybe help them begin something like in a correct way, at least in their perceptions of how AI is helping them. And then it gives them confidence to continue forward in the process. So it's kind of helping them not feel stuck that may create more anxiety about writing. And then students do some checking of GenAI output. So like I said before, there's a level of checking. It's maybe more of just the quality of how they're checking is maybe the issue, and maybe where the conversation should be geared towards, and less about like, oh, they're not checking the writing. They probably are. They probably just not doing it well. So my next study was looking at student interviews. So I wanted to get a better understanding of what students, think in a more conversational way. So these interviews was anywhere, well, I think at most was like an hour long interviews where I was just talking about students about their writing lives without AI, just to get a better sense of like how writers perceive themselves. Their understanding of writing, and then asking, how is that maybe shifting or changing when AI comes into the picture. So like the perceptions of what academic writing is, because I think the response to that was quite interesting, especially when looking at the survey. With that one question I previewed, that students were, felt like the classroom wasn't preparing them to do the writing. So I thought it was a good question to ask, like, do you understand what you're doing in this space? And if they're able to describe that and articulate that. And then understanding like how they're writing with AI. So getting a sense of them to walking me through the process. If they use AI at what moments, what stages, to talk more kind of, openly about it. And then getting their opinions on, once again, more ethical concerns about AI, like in conversations surrounding AI. And then understanding the types of usage, and discussing AI disclosure. So what students feel by AI disclosure. So the responses fell into two categories. They either said no, they wouldn't disclose it because they don't feel like they're using it for like nefarious reasons, or they say yes, they would disclose it because they don't feel like they're using it for nefarious reasons. So there's definitely I think a feeling that how they're writing is very much rooted in a way of how their use of AI is very much rooted in like they don't think or see themselves as doing it in any type of wrong way, but they feel like there's a judgment attached to whether they reveal their use of it or not. And so whether they disclose it is very much rooted in if they feel like they're going to be judged based on their usage of it, even if they feel like they themselves aren't using it in a way that they feel is inappropriate. Then most users are cautious users. So the one thing about the participants for this study, they all were most of the participants for the study articulated themselves as being competent writers, that they consider themselves either decent or pretty good writers, and they all came from classrooms that were like that heavily spoke about AI usage and that were openly had discussions about it. And so I thought that was interesting because their responses very much reflected that they came from classrooms that had open discussions, because some of the things they said were, very nuanced, and like, what AI's capability is, how AI works. As you can see, some of these responses, like, there's no emotion to AI, and that like we shouldn't just tell AI it's flawed. They could see, like, they can understand why teachers are against it. And so I bring this up because I think it's important to know, because I have a friend in high school that is doing also AI research, but she's doing it from the teacher's perspective. And her results that she showed in one of her studies she has done is that instructors that talked more about AI usage in their classes and had open discussions about it, and assignments that dealt with it, experienced less usage of AI and assignments submitted. And then instructors that chose not to talk about it experienced more usage of AI in their assignments that were submitted. So I think I bring it up to say, like, I think that when there's open discussion, students tend to be more knowledgeable about this technology, and tend to be more critical of their usage of how it's maybe helping or hurting them when they're conducting writing. So continuing forward, how they view themselves as a writer may dictate use. So as I kind of previewed, that most of the writers can consider themselves pretty confident in their writing abilities. And those writers are often articulated that they didn't use AI because they felt like they could do it without using AI. But when a writer considered themselves like not the best writer, then they were more likely to use it. And so I think once again that shows like how are we developing writers in the classroom space, and how maybe are they being developed prior to coming to a higher education institution. How is that affecting their ability to feel like they can do the writing themselves? Um, and so that may be another point of concern that we think about in terms of how we address students' uses of AI is like their confidence as writers. And I think, also being someone who works in the writers workshop on campus, our writing center, I frequently and often hear when writers come in, the first thing to say, I'm not good at writing, I suck at writing, or they talk about like, oh, I use AI, but I don't know if it's helping me. And so there's a lot of anxiety about the ability to write. And so I think this comes down to like how are we developing them, and how is that being fostered in any classroom space, not just a classroom that's specifically focused on composition, but their upper level classes where they're expected to submit writing, but maybe don't feel the most confident about their ability to do what they're being asked to do. And then students report using it more for the early stages. So once again, this was very much reflective of the first study that students use it at the bookends. They use it for the early stages, brainstorming, or late stages, the editing and grammar. So to me, I think that just emphasizes that these tend to be the more stressful situations for writers to be in, to know how to start writing, and then making sure the writing sounds good once they have it completed. And then how students understand academic writing. And so this question was quite funny. When I asked them, no one answered the question the same. Everyone has something different. As you can see, they described it based on form or content, style, a tool for learning, opinion-based, professor-guided, lack of free will. That was quite funny when someone had articulated that. And then factual research based, knowledge demonstration, concision writing. And then a couple of students had asked me before they even responded, like, actually, that's a great question. What is academic writing? And so, I think that's important because, we're expecting them to do academic writing, but they may not actually understand what academic writing is. So that could speak once again to like, maybe what can we do to have them better understand the very thing that we're assessing them on, the capabilities to understand their critical engagement with a particular topic, especially in fields that we're writing as the demonstration of your knowledge. So them not understanding how to do academic, understanding how to describe it, I think speaks to, we often maybe don't even talk about that in our classroom spaces, like what academic writing is. We say, hey, here's an essay, this is the prompt, have fun. And that can only go so far sometimes. And I think this question kind of demonstrated that very clearly for me, because it's not something I ever really thought about. And then I was like, well, yeah, I guess that is a good question. What is academic? So what does these results show? So students can be cautious users of GenAI. I think this shows that even though, like I said, most of the students in this particular study consider themselves competent writers and were cautious users, it shows that this group of students do exist out there, especially when they come from classes where there's been open conversations about AI. So I think that shows like maybe one tactic of trying to get students to be critical about AI is to make sure they come from a classroom space that's fostering, critical engagement with it. And that even, even the most cautious user is going to use AI in some capacity, because all of them reported using AI, and whether it was something small, they reported using it. So I don't think necessarily there's a completely passive user of AI. Maybe, of course, there are, but I think generally people are actively using it. It's just the quality level of how they're actively using it. And so I think having these crop of students for this study kind of very much demonstrated that to me. Confidence of the writer matters. So as I was touching on, the more confident the writer feels, the more likely they are to kind of maybe engage in that independent work without the use of a particular technology to kind of help them do that. and then how students understand the utility of writing matters. So in some of the responses that I didn't get, don't have the time or space to highlight, they very much were, could talk about like, why they understood like why doing the writing was important. And I felt like when they understood that utility of it, then they were less likely to use AI. Whereas students that I felt that where it feels like if students don't understand that utility of like, oh, the critical thinking or whatnot, then maybe they'd be like, okay, it's just an assignment for a grade. Let me just get it done and move on. And not realize that, oh, that may come back into play when you have to do the in-class exam or whatnot. And now that knowledge work that you pass over to AI is now, you don't have that. And so, but these students often frequently spoke about like wanting their ideas to be the, front centerpiece of what they're writing. And so I think that's an important thing to understand of like that confidence matters. And there may be a lack of understanding of what academic writing is or how to do it. So that question demonstrated that they were just kind of guessing for the most part. Like none of the participants like definitively said, this is academic writing. They're like, I guess it's these things. And we're just listing and describing proponents of academic writing or, or their experience with it. So I think this is a space, once again, where maybe we need to think kind of more critically about how do we teach writing, and not just, like I said, in those composition classes, but beyond that. Like, it's something that I think that we may have been taken for granted. And I think AI has kind of revealed that, like, we may have, not have taken for granted those conversations about what writing is, especially in like a higher education institution. So the last study, I'm currently still doing the study. I started it in the spring. And so this study wanted to get more at like those like organic usage. So I did a study where I'm observing students using AI, and I'm basically they have a writing task I'm giving them, and I'm giving them a writing task and a time frame they're doing, and then in that writing task they are doing, and they are basically giving a prompt, and then they are to complete that writing task in that time and the time frame, and then they are given free reins to use AI as much as they want or as little as they want, and I'm just observing them do it, which is quite interesting to see at what points they're using AI. But the point of this study was to get a better sense of like what stages of invention do writers incorporate GenAI. So like the planning stage, so like everything that starts off like getting the writing started, so brainstorming, understanding the article, and so forth. Suggestions, not suggestions, sorry, the transcribing stage, so the act of actually doing the writing, and then understanding the review stage, so like reviewing and editing and all that part of the process. And so that's what this project is trying to focus on. And then getting understanding of like feedback, suggestions, and ideas do writers seek from GenAI. So like actually seeing that them do it, like so how are they engaging with AI with a prompt or whatever automated writing technology they're using? How are they, and like what is the response to that? And then understanding like how are they taking those suggestions? Are they editing it? So seeing that kind of in real time instead of them just talking about it, but actually witnessing it. And then how are they modifying the output? So, some of the sample observation. So thus far, like I said, this is ongoing research I'm still doing. The use of GenAI or other automated technology. So students only use technology at the beginning stages to help them get started, and at the end to polish. So once again, kind of being a dead horse, but it shows that students tend to use it at those beginning and ending stages of their writing process. So one student in particular, so they had like an article they had to read before they did the writing task. And so they I think they used ChatGPT to basically summarize the article. So that was showing that they wanted a quick synopsis of what the article was about before they engaged in writing. So it was stuff like that at the very beginning or the ending where they wanted like the, ChatGPT or Grammarly or whatever they're using to just edit it to make sure it sounded good. So I think once again, this is showing kind of those concerns for those two parts of the writing process, the beginning and the ending. And then they may use it, use may depend on prior knowledge and comfortability with the subject. So almost all the participants thus far highlighted that whether they use AI was dependent on whether they understood what they were writing about, and whether it was a subject they were comfortable with, or even if they cared about what they were writing about. And so I think this is a determining factor of of what students will do when they don't necessarily understand something. And this may be probably a more complicated issue to solve, because how do you solve someone's interest in something? Because it just depends. And then especially, now we have a technology that can just help you maneuver to something you don't like, then it's kind of hard to make an argument to them to say to do the opposite. If they're like, well, I don't care about this stuff, or it's not relevant to me, why should I, do all this independent work by myself? So here are some sample quotes. So there was like a post observation interview I did with them to have them talk through their writing process, to have them, kind of give a better conversation of what they were doing. And then also I asked questions about things I was noticing, and then just more broad questions about like how they use GenAI when they write. You can see in the first quote, I probably in this instance use AI to then take my final product and put it into AI with the article and see if it's like accurate summary. So they're using it to check accuracy. So for some reason, they feel AI is helping them do once again, those final steps, and it's more accurate than their ability to look through it to check stuff themselves. The next quote was highlighting is helping them complete a task and they're not focused. So this student pretty much described AI as being something that so for example, I asked her if this process of how she used AI during the observation would be the same if she used it at home. And she was like, yes and no. She's like, I probably would have used it more at home. Because she's like, I would probably be more distracted by other things. And so I would then use AI just to help me get the task done. So it's very much AI is being used as something to help them just maneuver through tasks sometimes. And so I think this goes back to highlighting them that might not necessarily understand always the criticality of why the writing is important. And that the environment can definitely impact whether they end up using AI or not. And then the last quote is a student basically using GenAI to help summarize reading. So what I was just saying, if they're not interested in something, they will maybe just have AI summarize it in those regards, so they don't have to read the thing or in their mind waste time and labor on something. But I think wasted labor always comes back to haunt you later. But like I said, that goes back to not necessarily understanding the point of doing something, and so maybe that's maybe the emphasis of what is happening in classroom environments. Students maybe not seeing the use of doing a certain assignment and how it's going to help them succeed. And maybe focus should be recentered on making and building classrooms where everything they're doing feels like productive to their learning. So, and then students that are aware of the writing process may tend to avoid GenAI usage. One participant particularly thus far was very articulate of at what points their writing process without GenAI, and discussing, okay, do I do this first? Then once I do this, then I move to this. And was very knowledgeable of how they write. And I think that dictates a lot of how they will go about using GenAI or not using it in her case. So she very much highlighted she wouldn't use it because she understands how she writes and how to maneuver herself through each of the steps of the process. So I think this is showing signs that maybe if students understand the writing process, then they're more likely to not use AI to help them, skip some of those crucial steps that are important to their, critical engagement with whatever they're doing. And then there also may be assumption that GenAI works better than editing features in Word document and Google Docs. This is something I noticed is that, you have Google Doc, you have Word Doc that does the grammar editing and fix all syntax stuff and awkward phrasing and whatnot, but they seem to now have a distrust in that and feel like AI can better help them edit their writing, and so they're looking at AI as more of doing that editing work that Word document and Google Doc has typically been the use. So I think that's an important thing to look at and to understand. Like maybe like that's how they're using AI in those regards, and maybe and I think that goes back to the quality of use of AI. So whereas I feel Word document, or at least prior to the Copilot like integration, it wouldn't rewrite your whole entire text for you. Whereas I think uploading your essay to AI, it may engage in more like changes that they may feel like, oh, this is doing a better job of rewriting this for me than a Word document or Google Doc can do. So what did these results show? So thus far, it shows that, once again, they use it at the beginning and ending stages of the writing process. And so the planning review stages, so they tend to still try to do the writing themselves. I think that is one of the big things that I kind of witnessed thus far in this study is that they'll use a beginning, but they want to do the writing themselves for various reasons. Either they're scared they'll get caught for using AI, so they don't want to risk using AI to write it, so they write it themselves, or they have this feeling of wanting the writing to sound authentic, so they make sure they do that because they feel like AI can't talk about or it doesn't have personal experience that they can bring into their writing, or they feel like they're capable of doing it without AI. And then if a student feels comfortable and understands the material and assignment, they may use GenAI less. So once again, I think this goes to if they're knowledgeable of what they're doing, they're less likely to use something to help them get through it. And so I think this speaks to just familiarity with different genres of writing, different subject matters, will ultimately impact uses of GenAI. And so like thinking about how can we navigate that, in the classroom space of creating moments where students understand what they're doing. So there isn't just this default, decision to use AI. Right. So looking at all my studies, these are some emerging things I'm kind of seeing. So a lot of findings are showing that the classroom may not be preparing them as writers and how to maneuver through the writing process. So this seems to be the perceptions of writers that don't feel confident or explain why they use AI. It seems to be that whatever they think writing should look like, they don't feel like the teacher, the instructor, the classroom space is helping them understand that or figure out how to even do that. And they feel like AI is now like that teacher of writing. And so I think once again, this kind of going back to how I started, like this drudgery of writing, that's what for students they feel like it's just laborious work that they don't want to engage in because they don't feel like they've been taught how to do it adequately. And here's this technology that can help me do this adequately. And then writers care more about writing and feel GenAI can assist them with system sound to sound better. So based on their perception, based on a lot of perceptions, they feel like whether it's at the beginning stages, ending stages, or even just doing the writing, they feel it can assist them. So regardless, if instructors, administrators, we feel like it doesn't do certain things to them, they feel like it's beneficial. And the writers typically use GenAI at the beginning and ending stages. So kind of what I said prior, that those tend to be the most highlighted stages. So yes, there's students that will use it to write their whole text or chunks of their text. But I think the majority of students feel like they struggle in those two moments. And so I think how we can kind of conceptualize GenAI is looking at it as a tool that students will use when they feel the pressure of writing or outside pressures that impact their ability to write. So when they feel like writing is stressful or creating anxiety, now there's this technology that they feel helps them navigate that. Or if they're in a certain environment that may impact their ability to conduct writing, if they're distracted, they may feel like, hey, let me just get this done since I'm getting too distracted. So they're seeing AI as a fix to problems that they are experiencing when engaging in writing. And then the new college students' use of GenAI in their writing process is impacted by their prior and current experiences with writing inside and outside the classroom. So this becomes reflective of my interview study that students who have positive experience with writing tend to be more competent and more confident in their ability to write and more willing to engage in that writing process, where I feel students that highlighted like they don't have positive experience or they have negative feelings about writing tend to want to use AI more. And so I think this, especially with the new generations of students coming in, they're coming in with AI already being a thing. So it's going to impact how they perceive what writing looks like. So some recommendations. So obviously critical AI literacy, but some comments I want to make about that is that students are more critical and intentional about their AI usage than we may assume. And they want to use it responsibly. Like I said, I think it's a quality issue. I don't necessarily think that there isn't like a critical engagement. It's just maybe not the type of critical engagement that we are looking for when they're using AI, or we're hoping they do when they use AI. And then students use AI because they care about what they're writing. I think that's a misconception that they're using AI because they don't care. I think they're using it because they do care. They want to get a good grade. They want to sound correct. They want to perform what a good writer looks like. And so they're using it to do that. Even if we may feel it's like academic dishonesty, they may feel their writing is too subpar to be submitted, and therefore AI is the solution for them. And then writing feedback is going to be the same regardless if you use AI or not. So I emphasize this because a bad sentence, an unclear sentence is going to be an unclear sentence. You're going to get feedback on that sentence the same way. So, and that feedback is the important aspect of that. So if AI wrote it, cool. It is still a bad sentence, then you would say why is it a bad sentence, and that feedback is going to be important. And then most students will realize like, oh, well, AI can't help me do that. Or maybe they'll be like, okay, so that's how I write a good sentence. So in that feedback, they may learn how to do the writing that we want them to do. So I think we need to focus more on the feedback and less on like maybe the AI aspect of trying to figure out if they use AI or not. So I think this can look in many different forms. So this could be reflective of GenAI usage rationale. So not just asking them to disclose use, but asking them to think critically about their use. Like, how did you use it? What points of the process did you use it? How may you use this differently in the future? How may you be able to do this on your own? So to have them be more critical about how they're going about it and having them think through those choices outside of just using an AI. And then also, as instructors and administrators, we can maybe see trends in those disclosures based off of like what's, like, do we see a trend of students using it for one specific thing? Then maybe that's a opportunity for us to have a class that talks about how to navigate this particular issue with writing. So more critical engagement in that regard. And then guidelines about modeling or suggested uses of GenAI. So this, I think, is already being done, but I think it could be, done more, because I think it's the quality issue of how students are using AI, not a lack of critical use. It's that critical use may not just be the highest quality. So how can we engage more to make sure that quality is better? So they're being more active users in the way that we hope and we want them to be. And then don't police student writing. So I think when we start policing student writing, it echoes back to like when we used to police grammar, and sometimes we still do. And I feel like when we do that, it tends to disenfranchise certain types of students, and in that respect, it doesn't benefit anyone. So once again, focusing on the writing and less on the active use of AI is going to be important, because if we're the first thing we're thinking about when we get a student paper is, did my student write this? I think we've kind of lost the plot to a degree, and that we are now bringing questions of honesty about our students, and that doesn't help them progress forward in writing. So I think focusing less on like, did they use AI, and more about how can we address the concerns of the quality of the writing or the process of the writing. So focus on writing feedback, regardless if it's AI did or not. So once again, reiterating that point. And then also students may be turning to AI because the classroom instructor. So as I said before, I think it's, maybe they feel like the classroom isn't doing what they feel it needs to be doing for them to be successful. So, this is a big ask, this is a big thing to do, but like thinking about how we may reshape what instruction looks like and writing instruction looks like in the classroom space beyond just, Comp 1 classes or introduction level writing courses, but looking at like anytime you're writing in your classroom, you should engage in conversations about what your expectations of what writing looks like, and then answer questions, teach, students how to engage in those spaces so that they feel confident and they feel like they have that knowledge how to engage in those writing acts. Because I feel like when they don't, that's when they may be turning more to AI, as some of my results have shown thus far. So it's a big ask. There's not an easy solution to any of this, but I think my research is wanting to include more of those student voices to get a better understanding of what is going to be beneficial to them, and less of trying to be responsive to the technology, but being responsive to the students. So yeah, so with that being said, that is my presentation, and I will open up to Q&A.
Thank you so much, Antonio. If anybody has any questions, I'm speaking to the Zoom audience. Please unmute yourself and speak out, or post your question in the chat and I will relay it to Antonio. So since nobody wants to break the ice, if you are willing to share, what is your relationship with GenAI as a creative, as a writer, and as a teacher?
So I would say when AI initially started, I was extremely anti. I was quite negative about it. I was like, this is horrible, this is awful. But I think a lot of people were, because here's this invasive technology coming and disrupting things. So we tend to have initial reactions. But I think as time went on, I kind of took a step back and started to think about okay, why would students use this? And then experimenting within myself, I could see why. And so my relationship, I don't rely on it, I wouldn't say, but I'm not afraid to experiment and to see if it can help me. Because even if it can help me, it does still help me. So even if I'm okay, help me come up with something or help me think about whatever in a brainstorming stage. And it may give me something I hate that entirely, but now you gave me an idea of what I actually want to do now. So it's kind of like a negative reinforcement in a sense for me. So I tend to use it more of an experimental to see, can it do something? And if it can, okay, cool. And if it does it well, then I'm okay, how can I do that on my own kind of sense? So it's more of understanding the shortcomings of it and how can it better support my engagement in the writing process.
Thank you. Christy has a question. Christy, you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask the question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Hi, Antonio. Antonio knows me, but for everyone else, I'm the rhetoric director. So we're obviously dealing with a lot of AI, and I really, really appreciated hearing from the perspective of the student. So thank you so much. My question was, this was so fascinating to me just because I guess I'm wondering, do you think that students are telling you a bit about what they think you want to hear? Because I'm seeing very different things. Not very different, but I'm wondering, I see the worst, right? By the time it gets to me, we're dealing with academic integrity issues. And so I'm thinking about our two different experiences and what's happening. And so this is so fascinating to me. And I know we can talk about this more, not in front of everyone else, but I'm wondering if you've thought about the types of students who are opting into your study, that they seem very invested. I'd love to hear more about the types of classes that are represented. But if you've thought about is this a comfortable space for you to focus on the students who want to be doing this? Have you thought about who may not be represented in the study, or because students are notoriously underreporting their AI use? So anyway, I'm just asking for your thoughts about that.
No, yeah. So this stuff is something I definitely have thought about. Definitely talked about with my advisor, my committee, of just obviously students that elect to do a study are going to be the ones that are more likely to, probably, I would say probably are more conscious, or cautious users, or more competent users of it. But I would say most of the students that I think I said for the interview study, that are students that are coming from classrooms that have open discussions about AI, and that's just based off of the type of things that they're saying. I do understand there's definitely worst cases of that, and I think in relation to like thinking about like what my studies have like are showing or doing thus far. I think it may speak more to that like concern of like I think it comes to the concern of like feeling like they may feel like inadequate in their writing, or is like I think it goes back to like questions like concerns about like I'm not a good writer, so let me just use AI in these very like extreme ways, or it may be like I don't care about this particular assignment, or I don't see the utility of this particular thing, regardless of the variety of reasons, and that may be where those extreme cases come into play based off of like their perceptions of what they think they may or may not get out of doing the assignment themselves. And so I think in some of the interviewees and participants in the study did like hints at that in some of their other responses of like I highlighted one where like if they're not interested in something, then they're going to use AI more, or they would highlight just like they would highlight it being just something to help them get through the process a lot quicker, and not want to sit in those moments of like struggle. Like if they feel like they can't like get the writing process started, or they feel like the writing is taking too long, then here's AI to help me just zoom through this process. So I think a lot of those extreme cases could just be like AI has been a fix to not experience writer's block, and understand like writer's block can be a very positive thing, and how when you sit in those moments of struggle and figure out. But I feel like now I feel like students are maybe feeling like they're doing so much at this point where they feel like AI is just this fix to just get through things and get things done to get the grade they want, and that's it.
There's a question in the chat
Thank
from
you.
Jamali.
Yeah.
The question is, how do you see writing instruction / academic writing developing in the future as AI is used more and more?
So that is something like, I mean, ideally, I would see, ideally, I think many of us would wish AI never came, because it just has complicated what writing looks like in a lot of ways. But I think with AI being used more and more, I think classroom spaces are going to have to be more open to potentially having units of AI. And it's not just being, or maybe there may be a course that is now taught about appropriate uses of AI, or how to use AI critically if it is in every classroom. So I think that's maybe what writing instruction could potentially like look like if this continues to develop in the way that it is that it's going to have to be like countermeasures put in place to kind of better make sure there's critical engagement and critical usage of writing when using AI.
Now a question from Brian. What thoughts do you have about how to encourage students that learning to write is something that requires personal effort, a lot of trial and error? And Brian goes on to say, good writing in an authentic style is hard, if not impossible to mimic. For example, watching an AI write in quotation marks and then simply trying to follow. My own perspective is that AI might be able to offer examples of good writing, and it certainly can offer summaries of good writing processes, but can't replace the process of learning.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think unfortunately, I think this, the bigger answer is like this goes beyond just higher education spaces. This starts in K through 12, and what happens in there then carries over to here. But I think what we could do at our like higher education level is to not have assumptions about what students know or think about the utility of writing. I think often there's this kind of like this feeling like students have done writing, they're coming into college, let's teach them how to write at the college level, but there may not be all those like critical conversations that are needed for them to truly understand why this is important. I think maybe this is a bigger question about like what students feel about their undergrad experience when they're conducting that work in regard to because I think once they get to grad school, if that's the route they take, they realize, oh, all that stuff is really important. I really do need to know how to write. I do need to know how to critically engage with the work I'm reading, because that's what I'm being judged on, and that's what's going to help me get this degree. But the undergrad level, I think, is very much, I think it's very much looking at it from this simple on the point of like assessment. And so because I had a student in one of my interviews that talked heavily about like her fear is that AI is going to be used more because it's very much an assessment model in terms of how we navigate through academia. And the longest that's like the biggest thing that people care about, then, the utility and the, of writing is not necessarily always going to be something students think about first. So I think like, once again, opening up conversations in the classroom, taking the time to, spend that first or second week of class having those conversations and maybe showing like what it looks like of like for a student, that engages in that work and where it ends up being, and then versus a student that doesn't, and talking about like why is it important and showing like the levels and the steps and the trajectory of what happens when you are engaging in that critical work and what it looks like, sharing your personal story maybe like of like, you maybe not being the best writer and then how you actively worked on it and how and then where you're at now. I think that trajectory maybe is the part that I think students maybe not understanding or be thinking about of like me doing this writing work now, where does this take me later? I think especially when there's this technology and to their understanding, they feel can do it for them. So what is the point of me knowing how to do it? So I think is time for like classrooms maybe to think about how to incorporate more of those like, I think, kind of like beginning work of engaging in those thought processes, because I think we take those for granted sometimes of like of feeling that, oh, Comp One can do that, or oh, they should have learned that in high school. This is busy. This is extra work for me to do, but maybe not thinking about it being extra work, because I think AI is showing us like this isn't extra work. This is work that we maybe have been just dismissing and taking for granted and didn't realize the importance of it.
Thank you. We're almost at time, and I don't see any other questions in the chat. So this is the last call for questions. Otherwise, I want to thank Antonio. Please join me in thanking Antonio for this wonderful presentation. I'd like to invite you all to join us again this Friday. I posted a link to the description of the session we'll be hosting on Friday. That one is fully remote. The Zoom link is provided in that link that I put in the chat. And and the recording of this session will be made available probably at some point next week on our Media Space channel. So once again, thank you everyone for your attention, and enjoy the cooler weather.
Thank you. Thank you.